welcome back to Adam. Thank you all for showing up. Raise your hand if you have been to Adam before. Okay, so we have a lot of newcomers. Adam has been historically this advanced topics on machine learning discussion group, so we'll read papers and then discuss them. And then it also kind of evolved into people presenting on topics as well. So Thomas this week is going to present on notebooks and using them in production. So we welcome discussions. You can raise your hand if you have a question during the talk at all, but we can also kind of chat a bit at the end about your thoughts and opinions. So I'll kind of hang out to the side, and if you raise your hand, either myself or Thomas can call on you to ask questions. And then, thank you all for coming. I'll kick it off to Thomas.
All right. Hey, how's everyone doing? This is my first time here as well, and hope I can bring something of usefulness to your work. Starting off with some bad news, I don't have a GPT-4 to present today, but it might be a little bit more humble topic on using Jupyter notebooks, maybe some best practices, maybe being able to push it a bit further than just like a experimentation tool. So maybe starting off with a show of hands, like how many people use notebooks for their work? Okay, maybe around half of you guys. And how many of you guys like notebooks? Okay, so pretty much everyone who uses it likes it. That's good to hear. Well, regardless of what camp you're in, hope you can get something useful out of tonight's talk. So the talk is named "Should We Like Notebooks?" and a bit of origin story on that. There are a couple pretty popular videos that have been going around. You might have seen them. One of them is from Joel, who's I guess local in Seattle, but he really does not like notebooks, and he goes into a lot of detail on why he does not like them. And there's a YouTube link if you're interested in his talk, and I'll share the slides after the talk so you can click through any of these things that are of interest to you. And then a couple years after that, there's another talk, "I Like Notebooks," from Jeremy Howard, who's part of Fast.ai. And you can see, what do we think? Like, what should we think? Should we like notebooks or not? I don't know. So, yeah, maybe today's talk will help you answer that and perhaps have some discussion, form your own opinions on what you think, and maybe there might be some tips that allow you to take notebooks further than how you're currently using them. So, let's start getting the negative stuff out of the way first. The stuff that's shameful about notebooks, like that's bad practices, the hidden state, the doom of everything. So some of the criticisms of notebooks are related to reproducibility. For example, notebooks, like their flexibility is one of their main drawing points, but also it gives you a lot of power to do bad things. You can run cells out of order. For example, you define a function later on that you used previously, and then someone else tries to run the notebook from start to finish, and then the function name isn't defined. It turns out they have to run the cells in the order you ran it in, which might not be obvious. And also in hidden state is maybe you wrote some code, you changed something for some reason, and then forgot to update all the outputs of the cells, and then someone reading your notebook goes like, hey, where did this output come from? It doesn't match what the code shows. So those are two things around reproducibility. And then one more thing is around dependency management, and I have kind of like a real life story around this from very recently. So you can see in your notebook, you can import a bunch of stuff, but where does it come from? Like, what's the version of these things? And who knows? And very recently, this is one example I ran into during work where one of the scientists I was working with, they were using an API from stats models, the MSTL, which is a time series thing for multiple, forgot what exactly it was, but it's a function that's in the experimental branch or the dev branch only. And it turns out even if you try to install the very latest versions of every single package, that wouldn't have solved the issue. You'd have to figure out that it was actually in the dev branch, and whatever command the scientists ran on their laptop to get this to work, who knows? So then around collaboration, there's also a couple of criticisms. One is it's very hard to source control IPython notebooks. For example, I guess I'm not sure if anyone has tried to open a notebook with a text editor or something instead of Jupyter, but essentially it's a giant JSON file with a bunch of metadata and stuff like that. And like here I maybe made like 1 or 2 lines of code change, but you can see this is the diff when I try to make a pull request in Git, and I'll show you a bit more on it later. And another criticism is around automation. Like it's quite difficult to do stuff like testing or linting your code, type checking your code, things like that. And then some other miscellaneous gripes around dev experience maybe is there's a little bit of lack of, or maybe unintuitive static language analysis in Jupyter. If you're in Jupyter, if you don't run the cell, you're not going to get any auto-completion results. For example, this screenshot is me tabbing after I imported a library. Because I didn't run the cell yet, you get nothing. But in like other IDEs, such as VS Code, you see it has a static analyzer that can give you some auto-completion even if you haven't run the code yet. And that works regardless if it's a Python script or a notebook that you're opening in VS Code or the IDE. So that's one thing that people don't like so much about Jupyter, although some people argue that Python is a dynamic language. It's more correct to try to make inferences after you run the code, but in terms of convenience, obviously having that static analysis helps. And then type checking as well. Like in a notebook, you can obviously give it the type hints as much as you want, but there's nothing to verify it or give you an error if you don't do something according to the types. Like here I say this function should return a data frame, but I just return a number, and there's nothing to say I can't do that. So to recap all these things, this is you. Maybe you like notebooks from what I've heard in the audience. And then there's all these things that pile on. It's like maybe you shouldn't use notebooks. And I think engineers are the biggest, engineers are the most hesitant to adopt notebooks because of these issues. And then maybe you're not so happy anymore. So why do we still use them? Well, there's obviously like people on two ends of the extremes. Like in terms of data research scientists and domain experts, I think what they like about notebooks is just how easy it is to get into them, for example. And then engineers, they really care about code quality and best practices and things like that, and they will tell you you should learn how to package things properly. You shouldn't keep using notebooks. So yeah, some of the pros for notebooks are they're hassle-free, they're low barriers to entry for people who are perhaps coding is perhaps a means to an end to do whatever experimentation or science work they do, and it's not their primary job to engineer good code. And it's also a very familiar and consistent experience no matter where you go. Like regardless of whether you're running Jupyter on your laptop, you're running it in like any cloud providers like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Google Colab, and whatever like employers you're working with, you tend to know what to expect with a Jupyter environment. Lastly, one thing that is kind of overlooked is that it gives these types of non-technical people a way to kind of have like an environment that saves their progress intermediately. Whereas like if you're running some code locally, once you shut down your laptop or you disconnect from maybe a remote server or something, you kind of have to start from scratch. And for engineers, they have stuff like SSH and Tmux and stuff like that. But for other people, Jupyter is their way of having an environment that they can save their progress even when they turn off the laptop for the night. But even for people who have the choice and experience to use other solutions besides notebooks, there are still some benefits and reasons we turn to them, especially like at work. Most of the time I'm writing code in Java and Python packages, but there's also a lot of times I'm actually using notebooks, and that's that's by choice. So one of the biggest use cases is the ability to develop incrementally. Like if you're like developing some data processing, and the data set might be like 20 gigabytes or even terabytes, and you're trying to write a bunch of queries on it in sequence, and you want to like make sure each query works one by one, and then make sure you have the intermediate result rather than having to restart the entire thing from end to end after you write something wrong in the next query or something. That is painful without interactive environment like Jupyter or IPython or something. But the problem with IPython is that the history gets kind of messy and it's hard to keep track of what actually matters in the REPL history. And also, as engineers, it obviously facilitates the cross-disciplinary communication between engineering, science, and product. Like a lot of times, you can just directly share the results of our notebooks with the PMs, and they might be able to ignore the code, but they'll understand most of the context, like your markdown writing in it and stuff like that. And this is way easier than trying to explain, like you have a package of like 30 different Python files. Where should I look to understand what's going on?
Do you think that these different sort of perspectives on this line, do you think they have different goals, or like it's not actually about necessarily like what their capabilities are, but maybe it seems like engineers focus on correctness, where data scientists or research scientists focus on like, is this valuable? Is this
There's definitely like a difference in objectives between scientists. As mentioned, like for scientists, their primary job is not to write like clean production code. Their primary job is to try out ideas, make sure ideas work. And for engineers, it's the opposite. But there's also some aspect of it that's based on your prejudices. Like as an engineer, everyone in your entire career has been telling you, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't be doing this. And even in cases where it might make sense, we might automatically reject the possibility of taking it further than as an experimental scratch pad. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on this also, because I think it's a really rich spectrum of experiences and like productivity. But also we can continue if there's
all right. I mean, and also, if you're a scientist, don't take offense to this image. I hope. I hope nobody is doing this. And yeah, so I guess the reality is that notebooks are kind of here to stay, regardless of whether you like them or not, and we kind of have to work with them. But I think the best we can do is, try to improve things and try to use them in a responsible manner, and not cause problems with them. Okay, so let's move on from the cons of notebooks and let's talk about are we actually using them as effectively as we can be? So there's a lot of different, different ways that notebooks go from ideation and experimentation into a real product and things like that. But one very common flow I'd like to call out is the production handoff model, where some scientist or someone does a lot of work in a notebook, and then they feel like at some point they're confident in their results, they want to turn it into a real product, and then they pass it on to some engineering team that maybe cleans things up and makes it production ready. And so you have a science team that has a Jupyter notebook that they feel like is ready to go. They tell the engineering team, hey, can you fix this notebook into a production service for us? And then, so the engineering team does some black magic, turns it into microservers, whatever you call it. And then, so 3 weeks later, engineering team's like, okay, we finished, but why is the number different now? So they go back to the science team, they do some collaboration to figure out what's going on, and they fix it, okay, cool, and then they deploy to production, nice. And then 3 months later, it turns out there's some production issue with the code, and maybe it's a more science issue, like something with the formula or the machine learning model or something, and they need to involve the science team again. They ask the science team to jump in, hey, why is this metric looking wrong or something like that? And then the science team's like, wait, I didn't write this code. I've never seen this in my life. Why is there 40 different Python files? So as you can see, there's probably some gaps here, and this handoff model is a very one-way, one-directional handoff process. Going backwards is very painful. And even if you're a single, you're a single contributor to a project, once you take this path of taking your notebook, breaking it down into modules for production, it's very hard to get back the benefits of the notebook of being able to incrementally test things out and easily iterate on it. So let's move on to maybe some solutions or maybe cool tricks that could help. So starting off with some potential use cases for what we could use a notebook for beyond just an experimentation scratch pad. So again, with this line, there's like the side where like these use cases are ones where maybe you just ship the Python notebook, IPython notebook, and the other side is maybe you should go hire a senior engineer. So so some of the use cases where it might make sense to actually push the notebook further than experimentation is, let's say some PM asked you to generate some business report or some visualizations of some data or something, and that's something that they want to run periodically, maybe once a month or something like that, but not like every day, not real time or anything like that. At that point, you should question: is it worth trying to like convert this into a production pipeline with a huge data pipeline and integration with different dashboards and things like that, like Tableau, Grafana, whatever? Is it really worth that effort? Especially if it's just like a one-time ask from one person. And another use case that's actually kind of interesting is, as mentioned, a big use case of notebooks is being able to incrementally develop and test out long, expensive queries incrementally rather than running it end to end. And every time it fails, you have to restart from scratch. And obviously, there are ways to solve it even without notebooks. Like you can try to checkpoint your data into S3, but obviously, like it's not super convenient, and sometimes we just don't do that because it's extra work. So yeah, maybe you can just take your ETL job that you develop in the notebook because of that interactive experience, and you can just use it as a job runner rather than rewriting it in a Python package. And in general, I think a good fit for this is like integration code between different APIs, between different systems that probably doesn't have too much depending on it. Maybe there's dependency on its output, but not on the contents of the notebook directly. That would probably be a good use case for running notebook in production as maybe part of a job runner or something like that. And I think the most famous adaptation of these types of use cases are Netflix, and I liked the video, which was a pretty good talk. They probably like pioneered the idea of using notebooks as a production job runner, and they've been using it for all these use cases, from reports to ETL jobs. And some use cases where you probably don't want to use notebooks in production, like we're not saying just replace your entire engineering function with notebooks. There might be mission critical or real time dashboards that that has a lot of eyes on it and has to update every second or something like that. You probably want a streaming streaming data pipeline rather than a notebook that has to run occasionally. And obviously, software libraries like notebooks are pretty good at being a self-contained unit, but in software libraries, you tend to want to modularize as much as you can and test things independently. And there are people who swear by using notebooks to develop their libraries, but it's definitely not the norm. I'll talk about some options around there, but that's not something I would gravitate to personally. And yeah, lastly, use your judgment. Like if it's something that one PM asks for, or something you run occasionally, where it's not mission critical for the work, probably maybe there's a case for just running it through the notebook if the time saving is warranted. But if you do need the heavy amount of testing and integration with a bunch of monitoring, logging, things like that, maybe you should stick to the traditional software engineering practices. And one thing I want to call out with the Netflix talk is that they mentioned that there are some benefits to notebooks besides just the ease of integrating into production and the time savings. One is that they found it much easier to debug when things went wrong with notebooks. Because for example, if you have like some code on log somewhere, like I don't know, like AWS CloudWatch or something, a lot of people don't know where to find the logs and also how to associate those logs to like a certain line of code that went wrong. And that kind of depends on how diligent your engineers are about logging and making sure it's traceable to the right place and not swallowing stack traces and things like that. But with notebooks, it's very obvious. Like you have a notebook that failed, you can open the notebook directly and see exactly what cell it failed at and what the error was. There's no having to cross-correlate between logs and lines of code. So that's one benefit that Netflix called out for their use case. Okay, so what do we need to make this happen?
I think we got a question.
Yeah.
So one benefit I'm kind of surprised hasn't showed up yet is that notebooks you can have plots inline, whereas it's pretty much like the only tool that allows you to do that. And whereas anything else, you might have to like export them and access.
Yeah,
the
for
plots.
sure.
It's not fun.
Yeah, totally. So I think the call out was about like visualizations and plotting data. I think notebooks, like you can have that format of having markdown text, explanatory text, documentation, as well as code, as well as visualizations and things like that. And that's like, obviously that's why I called it out, maybe for some visual reports where it's a lot of work to try to, push those images somewhere or integrate it with a dashboard. It would make sense to use notebooks as a visualization tool.
I've also seen a lot of success with, I guess, from something maybe like closer to the engineering side, demoing like a particular like machine learning algorithm where you kind of just go through a bunch of like simulated data and show like how it works, the differences, like when it works well, when it doesn't work well in a notebook. So you kind of get like all the like diagnostic plots.
Right.
Plots that show differences in performance.
Right. So I guess
Everything
more
else is
as
modular.
more as in like perhaps educational tool maybe. Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the biggest use cases for notebooks is sharing ideas. It can even replace like entire presentation platforms just with a notebook. A lot of people do their presentations entirely from Jupyter cell from cell instead of having a PowerPoint, which maybe I should have done at some point more, but yeah.
That link's not working. Can you share it differently?
This one?
Hand typing it, so I may have done it wrong.
Wait, sorry. What link is on?
Can you go to that video?
Yeah, sure.
I think it looked for me. What's the gap? Is that an underscore?
Yeah, it's oh. Yeah, it's an underscore. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's actually not correct.
Oh, whoops. Okay, yeah, I'll fix that afterwards. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Do you mind if we share slides in like the Slack channel afterwards?
Yeah, sure. I'll send them over. Okay, so what do we need to make this happen? So one of the tools that is pretty cool that helps a lot with the source control aspect and collaboration and code review, which would, obviously be a necessary step to try to push notebooks past, being an individual scratch pad into something that can be shared and collaborated on. So this is JupyText. It essentially, what it does is it takes your IPython notebook, converts it into a purely text format, and I guess I can jump into showing you why this is necessary in a bit. Maybe I'll go over the next point first. The second thing is around reusability and automation. So let's say you have a notebook and you want to run it for like different date ranges to generate some reports or something. Well, the traditional way is, you would have someone go into the notebook, you change a bunch of variables like the dates and stuff like that, and share the result afterward. And we obviously want to automate that, perhaps even make it possible for someone like a PM to run the notebook themselves with whatever date range they want, rather than having to loop in a scientist or engineer or something for that. And one thing that helps with that is Papermill. This is a way to parameterize your notebook so that you can, run your notebook multiple times with different arguments, and then it'll output all the different outputs as separate IPython notebooks in some like output directory. It could be in some folder somewhere, or even directly into like S3 or some cloud storage. And with dependency management, unfortunately, there isn't really any like built-in tools in Jupyter, so you'd have to use some traditional Python management tools like VM. Poetry is a pretty popular one, and a lot of people, including Netflix, they use Docker to just make sure that everyone's notebooks run in the same environment with all the libraries that everyone uses installed. But yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of like roll your own, and like I think as a scientist you might be able to pick this up, but usually engineering team sets up some foundation for this that you can just work off of instead of having to set everything up from scratch. Okay, so lastly is we obviously need good coding habits to avoid stuff like out of order cells so that, like running the notebook in this way from end to end actually works. And hopefully, having these tools from above actually influences the habits a little bit. If your end goal is that your notebook can run end to end, given whatever arguments, then maybe you be a bit more careful in making sure you avoid any out of order execution or dependencies. But yeah, obviously that is kind of up to the authors. Okay, so let's try to do a demo of the two things that I mentioned. It's gonna be quite lightweight. I just want to show you like how easy it is to get started with these things. So in terms of JupyText, let me show you what it does. So,
Could you increase the size of it?
oh yeah, sure. So let me show you what is the problem with notebooks. Is that big
that's
enough?
great.
Yeah, so the problem with notebooks, so this is a pull request I did where I changed a couple of lines of code in a notebook, and I'll show you what the diff looks like with the IPython notebook format. You can see, like, what is all this? So some of this is related to the output, some of it is just metadata. Like, it's going to be very hard for someone else looking at this to judge, what you actually did in the notebook. But below is an output from JupyText where it converts all the code cells and the documentation into essentially like a Python script where there's no output or anything. And this is kind of, the idea is that you'll still be working in a Python notebook, but this mirrored copy of your notebook that contains everything except the outputs, that's what actually goes into a review process for someone else to have a second pair of eyes to look at. And obviously this is a lot more clear, like what did I actually do in the notebook, right? I made one line of change here, I made like another line of change here. So that's kind of the idea of JupyText, and I'll just show you very quickly how it works. So all you need to do is install a couple libraries. Like what I did was basically pip install JupyText, and after that you get some niceties inside of your notebook. So this is JupyterLab. So what you can do is you can pair a notebook with a light script. Is basically like a Python script. If I do that, I'll show you what happens. So now that I did that, there's a mirror copy of my notebook that is basically a Python script with all the contents. And this is actually, nothing is lost here except for the output cells, which you probably don't want to like check into source control anyway. Like you might want to keep a copy of the output just for reference, but that's not the reusable part of your code. So this is what it looks like, and you can even like open this directly as a notebook. You don't even have to, keep around two things. Like if you just open with JupyText notebook or notebook, you see that this Python file is rendering exactly like a notebook would, except maybe the output cells would normally not be here unless you already had a linked notebook that had outputs. But yeah, that's what JupyText does, and there's also other formats that work with JupyText as well. So I can pair with a Markdown, and now there's 3 different files that are all linked to your notebook, and this is a Markdown version where the code gets converted into like Markdown code cells, and then the main content will be your text inside the notebook. And this could be good if you want to like upload documentation or something. Especially if you're using your notebook for educational purposes, you might want to upload a Markdown file as like a tutorial rather than having it as a notebook format. So that's what JupyText does. It's very simple. You just pip install JupyText, and then you have all these things in your notebook already. And yeah, I'll just show you real quick. If I change something in my notebook, what happens? Like if I just do another import, then I can check that it's already synced. This one. Oh, I think you can only link one thing at once. So I linked to Markdown, and now it's Markdown. But if I change back to LightScript, then it should work. So let's see. Pair with LightScript. Sorry, I didn't test this beforehand, but let's just double check. Okay, so this is. Let me see. It should sync. Okay, yeah, it's synced. Maybe I just had it cached. But yeah, that's pretty much how it works. And one thing I know is that this is kind of like a one-way conversion. You have like a master file, and then it clones into a bunch of different formats. So usually you have an IPython notebook that you actually work with, and these are the outputs that you push as a like pull request to Git or something for other people to look at and judge your code.
So do you still keep the like IPython notebook in version control, like the IPython?
I think it's up to you ultimately. Like if you want a reference of the outputs, you can push it to source control, but then like like people don't have to actually look at it during like, a review process because there's so much going on there. They can just assume that like the Python file is the code that you wrote, and then the IPython notebook has the output cells or whatever for reference. But also some people just like put it into git ignore, don't push it at all. It's really up to you whether you need that reference or not.
Is there a tool that allows you to go backwards? So if you have the .md file, you run through some, I don't know, command line thing that gives you back the UID.
Yeah, that's exactly what Jupytex does. Like you can even like open the markdown directly as IPython, but in command line you can run like Jupytex something from to, and then it'll convert it between formats. But yeah, in the JupyterLab environment, you can open any of the supported formats as a notebook.
I might have missed this, but one thing we can do in Jupyter is just enter a variable and then run the cell and see its outputs.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put that to Python, the code will break. So
Right, so that's a point, like, you won't have any outputs in the Python file, but if you do open the Python file as a notebook, you can use it normally as a notebook. Like, if I just, let's see, this is the Python file. If I just open this as a notebook, I can still run my cells as normal. Yeah, so it works as a notebook. It's just like stripping out the outputs and stuff in the output, because you probably don't want that in source control anyway. Like, you want what produces the output, not the actual output in source control. Yeah, so that is Jupytex. And then the other thing that I wanted to go over was Papermill. And I just have a very quick example here where, let's remove that. So basically what I have here is a very simple notebook. It just loads some toy data sets from sklearn. And I parameterize like which data set we want to load. So there's a function name, like load iris or load blind or something. And I'm just like, this is just a toy example. In real life, you probably want to have like a report that takes in a date range or something, and then you output different notebooks depending on the date range. But in here, like I just have this variable, and then what I can do is there's both a Python API as well as a command line tool for Papermill. So in Python, I could just import Papermill. This is basically pip install Papermill, and then what I can do is I can call the function execute notebook, and you can see one thing to call out here is that this. So this is the input path, the notebook you want to run from, and the output for where you want to store the results of running the notebook, including all the outputs. And here I'm using the prefix text, which is a compatibility thing with light scripts, the Python scripts that are linked to the notebooks. So in case you're using Jupytex, this actually integrates very well with it. You can also just use IPython notebooks as the template to run from. But yeah, here let's say I run it for 2 different data sets and then want 2 different notebooks in the output. You just call that function and it runs the notebook in the background in its own Python. So I'll just overwrite. It runs it in its own Python execution environment, and then you can see if I go to output now, there are 2 different notebooks. They use the same template, but what happened is that it replaced the parameter, or replaced one of the variables with the parameter that I set. So this one was replaced with load blind, and you can see it's loading a different data set and printing that. And the way that works is in your template, all you have to do is there's this little like cogs thing on the right hand side of JupyterLab. You just have to add a cell tag and name the parameters, and then it'll recognize every variable defined inside that cell as a parameterizable variable. So if you like replace it in the command line, it'll replace that. And the same thing in the command line, like, let me see. Okay, this is a little bit hard to see, but just trust me that you can do the same thing with the command line. You just run like Papermill and then specify the notebook name and then the output path and then give it the parameters and it'll do the same thing. And you can imagine, running this manually, or you can set it up in some UI where PM can just like enter some text cell what they want as parameters and then press some buttons to run the notebook, or you can have it as something like a Lambda function in AWS. Anything would work. Netflix has their own complicated setup with a whole pipeline with job runners and things like that would be probably hard to replicate from scratch, but yeah, that's just how things are. Okay, so maybe I should pause. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I don't know if you thought of this, but if you use JupiText to generate something that you check in, and then you pull that back out and open it as a notebook, would you lose that parameter tag if you're trying to use this with Papermill, or does that hang out, and how does that work?
I think the parameter should be part of the data. Let me check. Yeah, so you can see here there's an annotation for tags.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, so it basically like all of the notebook metadata is serialized into this format. The only thing that's missing is the outputs.
Okay.
Any other questions, thoughts?
Very open-ended, but is there like any big gotchas or bugs that you've encountered using this kind of method?
I haven't really encountered any bugs. Like I think JupiText and Papermill are both pretty mature. There might be other plugins and stuff that are less well tested, but yeah. I mean, Netflix is using both of these things in production, so I'm assuming it can't be that bad.
Have you used NBDev at all?
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does a lot more, but it sort of
Yeah.
overlaps with some of the JupiText
Right.
functionality too.
Right. There's a lot of like competing products around this. I just chose maybe the least intrusive ones to focus on more. I'll go over a little bit with NBDev and stuff at the end, but yeah.
This is definitely part of our comment, but like I wonder if at some point like people are going to start using a tool that has like the same intended purpose as Jupyter, but doesn't have like as many of the gotchas. So for example, something that isn't stored under the hood is just like a giant like JSON thing that you have to source control, but it's just more or less like what you see is what you get in terms of like what you're editing versus what ends up in source control.
Yeah.
Just,
Maybe XML instead.
Yeah.
I tend to use R a lot, and RStudio, well,
Yeah.
Posit, which used to be called RStudio, which has changed their name because they want to focus on also supporting other languages, as this the tool called Corto now, which is
Yeah.
kind of like that. Like you can basically just type inline Python code chunks, and then in the end end up with like a QMD file.
Gotcha.
And it's just like more or less what you see is what you get. Like there's no JSON. It's just like it ends up exactly how it looks in the file.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't personally tried Cordova. I know NBDev integrates it with that heavily, but yeah, that's a good call out. Maybe I should look into Cordova and if it can like entirely replace Jupyter or something. But yeah, it seems like so far that in terms of like the direction NBDev is going, they use Cordova as an integration with Jupyter rather than like a direct replacement.
What exactly is NBDev?
NBDev is like a toolkit. It's like a huge set of tools related to all this notebook development stuff, like being able to diff notebooks, being able to like push notebooks as packages to PyPy, being able to like publish documentation on it. There's like a list of like 10 or more different commands related to the system. And the reason I didn't focus as much on it is because you kind of have to learn the workflow of it, and it's a lot harder to adopt than just like pip install JupiText.
It's good to know. For some reason, I thought NBDev was like a development branch of Jupyter.
Oh, yeah, maybe the naming is a bit confusing. But yeah, it's like development toolkit, I guess, for notebooks. I think the primary users of that have been people who just really need that like a link between documentation and code. But generally, I think it hasn't had so much traction in terms of its intended purpose of like developing libraries and stuff in notebooks directly.
I think even if you don't want to develop a library or use like a package export, I think it could be useful
Yeah,
if you
for
just
sure.
want to have more of a formal software engineering practice around
sure.
your notebooks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you're willing to spend like half a day or something getting used to the workflow that NBDev gives you, I think it can give you a lot of benefit.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
For development, I find I just like to have, if I have any code that is just like functions that have like use cases that I'm actually like, I'm not like winging them, they're actually like functions that need to be robust and reproducible. I just stick them in .py files and import them.
Right. Yeah.
Use like the Jupyter notebook
Yeah.
my files.
Yeah, that's probably the way to go even if you're using notebooks. Like if you have some reusable function or something, you should probably move it out to like a module in Python. But the notebook can still be a good place where you put like the stuff like the integration code that is only used in one place and not imported multiple times. But yeah, I guess the whole point is, like the people developing this stuff that you want to push into production, like they're most familiar with Jupyter, so maybe we can just take the shortcut of running what they're familiar with directly instead of having this whole conversion cycle and then, how do we go back, how do we collaborate beyond that point. Let me get to the end again. Okay, why did it do that? Okay, so that's the two primary things I want to go over. There's also some miscellaneous tips and tricks I wanted to share, just in case it helps. One thing is that Jupyter Lab, in more recent versions, I think it's like 2.2 or above or something like that, there's actually collaborative editing, just like Google Docs now. I'm not sure how many are aware of that, but it would be pretty helpful if you wanted to like work together with someone else on the same notebook. I can just show you really quickly how that works. Like basically all you have to do is, so the normal way to launch a notebook is like Jupyter Lab, but if you pass the collaborative flag on the version 2.2 or above, it essentially opens the same thing, but now it's a collaborative notebook. So I can just show you what happens if I have two different tabs open. And then let's have another tab. Sorry, I'm not a Windows native user, so apologies for my struggles. Let me just make a new notebook. I don't know what's going on here. So let's see. So yeah, let's say I type something. We open the same notebook on both ends. You can see that on the other end, you can see someone else is typing, and you can even go over here and edit the same line. And this is using the standard collaborative algorithm of operational. Sorry, I forgot what it's called, but there's an algorithm for it, and that's what powers Google Docs, and now it's in Jupyter, which is pretty cool. If you wanted to work together on someone, as long as your notebook URL is accessible by them, you could pair program on the same notebook. And another thing that I wanted to show really quickly is something called Store Magic. This is built in directly to IPython, so you don't have to even install anything. But if you wanted to if you want to just save some intermediate outputs really quickly before you have to shut down your notebook or something like that, For example, if you're in a cloud provider and your employer is worried about idle costs and things like that, you might have to shut down your notebook every night or something like that. But you might want to keep some results around. So if you have let's say you have some variable, all you have to do is just call store myvar, and then that would persist it. And if you restarted the kernel now, you can just retrieve it easily with store -r myvar, and now you can see that it's back. So obviously this is a silly example, but if you have some intermediate data result or something that isn't too large, but is reasonable enough that you want to keep it around instead of having to rerun it from scratch, this could be a good option without having to save it to S3 or something complicated.
Pro tip, I think you can run the cell with Shift Enter.
Shift Enter? Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe that's another pro tip, just use Shift Enter more. Yeah, so that's Store Magic, and then this is the slide around things like MBDev. And MBDime is another diffing tool where instead of Jupytext, where it converts your notebook into a diffable format, it just does a visual diff with your notebook directly. The only reason I didn't go over this more is because it's a little bit less portable, because whatever environment people are reviewing your notebook in, they would have to have MBDime installed. And I think there's integrations with GitHub, for example, but maybe not with other tools like GitLab or your internal source code software or something like that. And NBDev is the one we already talked a little bit about. It has a lot of overlap with the functionality we discussed, and even goes way beyond that. But there's a learning curve to it. Like, you have to get used to the notebook workflow and you have to do things the MD Dev way. But if you do have the time to get used to it and you like how it works, that might be a very good option. And it's from the guys at Fast.ai, the Jeremy Howard. There's a good website for that if you want to learn more about that.
Can I start perhaps with a really easy question, basic question? What exactly is the difference between like Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter Lab?
Okay, yeah, so Jupyter Notebook is a couple of things. It's a file format that has all this data that you can render as a visual notebook, with code and text and images and stuff. It's also like a runtime where you can run these notebooks and it has a Python interpreter in the background. Jupyter Lab is a newer, so traditionally there's something called Jupyter, right? It's this UI interface, and it had a lot of problems. Like, it didn't really have a good way of extending with plugins and things like that, and also I think people are looking for more of like an IDE experience where you can open a bunch of files in different formats, not just notebook formats. And I think Jupyter Lab was relatively recent, maybe like 5 or 6, I forgot when it came out, but it's meant to be a replacement for the old Jupyter where you pretty much just have like one notebook open at a time, but now you have an entire like file explorer to the side and you can install a bunch of plugins just like the IDE. I think most of the development focus has been on Jupyter Lab recently by the Jupyter maintainers. They're also, for the old Jupyter interface, they're looking to use the Jupyter Lab as the backend for that now. So if you really like the old interface, you can still use that. But probably they're going to migrate it to use the same backend as Jupyter Lab soon. But also, if you are interested in taking advantage of these features like file explorers and plugins, you can try out Jupyter Lab.
Yeah, I think you're going to try out Jupyter Lab. The old interface has been an issue for me for a while.
Yeah, so some of the things you can do in Jupyter Lab is like you can even have a terminal. Like you can launch a bunch of different stuff. You can have like a markdown editor, just like Microsoft Word. Well, probably not as feature packed as Microsoft Word, but you can probably do some basic editing in here. You can launch a terminal where you can just directly run commands and stuff. Yeah, it's similar to VS Code or something like that.
Right. It's good. I just switched my workflow over to VS Code because I was running into like weird issues with any kind of image in the entire Jupyter environment
Gotcha.
not rendering at all. So this looks like it could be something that is more, I guess, it's easier than the default interface, but not as involved as like a full-blown IDE.
Yeah, and I mean, I think VS Code is not a bad alternative to Jupyter either. Like all the things we talked about here, they all have plugins in VS Code as well, and VS Code can edit notebooks directly. You can even deploy VS Code Server, which is like a cloud web version of VS Code, just like the way Jupyter works. So if you wanted to run it on like some remote server, that would work as well.
How about Anaconda? Where do you install Jupyter Lab from? What do you consider the authority?
I personally don't use Anaconda as much, and also I don't really use Windows for dev. I'm just here because this is my only portable laptop. In Windows, I think, so Anaconda is a very easy way to get started with stuff in Python, but it is also quite heavy, and personally I just prefer to like install only what I need, not have like, every dependency that Anaconda includes. And the way I've been working is, oops, what is going on? I have no idea. Ignore that. Yeah, so I've been using Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is basically you can run Ubuntu inside of Windows, and that's like relatively recent. The past couple of years, Microsoft has spent a lot of effort making that possible. And pretty much most things have worked the same as if I was in Linux. Like I can install apt, install whatever, that all works in Windows.
So you use apt to install on top of Linux? Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much, yeah. In Windows, I'm not sure what version, maybe Windows 10 and above, you can install the Linux subsystem, which basically runs Ubuntu inside your Windows. And I think it's a lot more efficient than something like a VM, but it does similar things. You just do like WSL install and then type WSL and it goes from the Windows shell into the Linux shell. Do whatever you can.
You have two file systems to coordinate if you do.
Pretty much, yeah. Although I think you can access the Linux file system from...
You can
actually
access
happen both ways
They
now.
can access each other.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's an
exactly.
extra step to make it work.
Exactly, yeah.
That's Wizzle too.
guys are probably more familiar with it than I am. I just got it working for the sake of this demo. At home, I primarily use Linux.
But if you wanted to install on Windows, do you go to jupyter.org?
Well, I just install WSL and then I type like the apt install. Well, apt install Python and then pip install Jupyter.
And that was Jupyter Lab, not Jupyter.
Jupyter Lab is pre-bundled with. Actually, I think you still have to install them separately. You might have to install pip install Jupyter and then Jupyter Lab.
How about the cloud-specific notebooks, like Azure, SageMaker?
So SageMaker, I'm not super familiar with Azure, so I can't speak to that, but I'm assuming it works similarly. SageMaker, they have Jupyter Lab and Jupyter both prepackaged out of the box. You just start an instance, it already has it installed.
So you do all the same things.
Yeah, exactly. You can even, so some of my coworkers have asked, can I run VS Code on SageMaker? And you can do that. You can start a Jupyter instance and then run a command in the terminal to install VS Code server and then launch VS Code server from the Jupyter launcher. So that's something you can do if you really wanted to use VS Code inside of something like SageMaker that only comes with Jupyter.
There's a new tool called Jupyter REST that lets you use your notebook as a REST API. You can call it. It's a runnable service.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm not super familiar with
It's
that.
It's new. It's just
Gotcha.
barely coming out. It's going as open source.
Okay, so Jupyter REST, how does that compare with stuff like Jupyter Enterprise Gateway or?
I'm not an expert on the other
Okay,
stuff.
okay.
But I
Yeah,
saw someone present it a few weeks ago.
gotcha.
It's on
Okay.
GitHub.
Interesting.
And it's in pipeline.
Okay, I'm guessing that goes a bit further than the so the previous stuff is you can run a kernel that doesn't live inside your notebook. Like the kernel can be running at this separate machine with a bunch of different stuff installed, like a Spark cluster or something like that. What you're describing, maybe the notebook itself is the API. That's not
And
quite
you call the
interesting.
notebook itself. And it's
Yeah.
a service.
Okay, that's-
It has a listener. You can connect to
Wow.
API gateways.
Okay, that sounds very interesting, also a bit dangerous.
Hey, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
It's a misuse.
It really feels like, I feel like there's really strong worse is better vibes here, where there's correctness on one hand and productivity on the other hand, and with notebooks it's just so easy to just go in there and wiggle around in the notebook until you get the right thing. But then to productionize it, you essentially have to map that to, okay, what's the algorithmic problem, and then rewrite it. And I really wonder if is our notebooks for, oh my God, for web servers, I didn't think I'd ever be saying this, but is that kind of a correctness dead end where if you really need this thing to work and be correct and efficient, the notebook's never going to get you there? Or is this us finally adopting a new, more productive path to get there than the standard sort of write your web server, write a set of unit tests and all that stuff? There's a lot of stuff to recreate there, and
Yeah, that's very interesting of a point. I'm not really sure personally. I feel like this has been kind of a social solution. People who use notebooks are familiar with one set of things, and the people who do the engineering are familiar with another. And I feel like people who can develop web servers and stuff, they can probably do things the traditional way they wanted. So I'm not sure what would bring them to try to run a server through a notebook. Maybe there's a good reason to do
I
something.
mean, I can see some ad hoc use cases like using Excel external data that will automatically call out to an API as sort of a quick way to do some work in a notebook and pull it into an Excel
Okay.
live.
also
Definitely makes
humans
sense.
are expensive. The whole history of software engineering is finding ways for one person to be able to do more things. And if you don't need, 5 millisecond response times, maybe a notebook's fine.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Yeah,
makes sense.
They used R Markdown for similar weird use cases. You can build an entire website in it. You could probably do something similar with Jupyter, where the idea is you don't want to deal with handling CSS and JavaScript and how
Gotcha.
renders on mobile and desktop might run. But there's a library that allows you to basically run one quick command line expression and have an entire website built to have the standard tool you're
Yeah.
used to. And if you're dealing with that kind of use case, it's awesome.
Yeah, there's a lot of solutions that take notebooks very far beyond things we use them for normally. Like there's a library called Voila where people have basically made an entire like React web app inside a notebook. And then like as a notebook, it renders as a normal notebook. But then once you like hit it from a remote destination, it just looks like a normal website. So I mean, like that's something you could do. I'm not sure like what would convince you to do that over a traditional way, but it's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, it also seems like you need like a lot of interactivity. You might be better off using a dashboarding tool instead
Yeah.
of Streamlit. Like I've tried, there's probably like really good extensions, but I've tried to build in like sliders and similar things in Jupyter. They don't work nearly as well as just hooking up a Streamlit dashboard
Yeah,
and
for sure.
it controls all that.
Yeah, I guess whenever you're making some tool do something it wasn't intended to, there's a bit of fighting involved. Yeah.
I was wondering if you or anyone else has an opinion on using Databricks as this kind of like, some people are in notebooks, some people are
Yeah.
in libraries, and
So I
some work together. It's pretty close.
gotcha. Yeah. So I have not used Databricks too much personally, just because it costs money and I'm cheap. But I know they have a very well built out notebook pipeline where you can do these types of things. They can run notebooks as jobs and things, and it probably has most of these features as well. I think if you're using Databricks, maybe you don't need as much open source solutions or stuff because they have pretty good end-to-end integration. But yeah, in Databricks you can follow a similar pattern, which is a notebook that runs as a production job. You can schedule it the same way as another script.
I work at a place that, you know, I was doing Jupyter stuff, and the conversion to Databricks notebooks, it was like the little things, you know, shortcuts with different stuff. I use it just like I used to use Jupyter.
For sure.
It seems to integrate pretty well with people that, you know, use notebooks.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. I think Databricks does a really good job of like making the developer experience very fluid, and that applies to both the notebooks as well as Spark and stuff.
I think cost was the biggest thing for the company
Yeah.
I was at with Databricks, is it was just astronomical, the bills you could rack up on it.
Well, I guess it depends how much of the bills is just from the raw hardware that you're using under the hood, or from the like surcharge that
Yeah.
Databricks has. But maybe like the time savings balances out the extra cost.
Yeah. And I think if you run them as notebooks, they cost more than if you like run a script against the same clusters. So that's like, we never got around to like doing anything differently because I left that company. But that's like something else, is that like you pay a premium to run your jobs if your jobs are written as notebooks. At least 2 years ago 2 or 3 years ago when I was on the platform. I don't know
Yeah,
now.
that's what I was looking for, just other people's experience. I was against the Databricks when it started to get introduced, and I had nothing to do with the, you know, I have no idea what it cost. And a small company that doesn't have much money decided to go with it. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, there's always a convenience tax. The easier it is to do something, the more surcharge they can put, thinking that you will justify it with the time savings, even if it doesn't cost them that much more.
I think even just Jupyter itself, like it will get you to the answer faster than, you know, iteratively writing a script or, you know, like a package to do it. But you're like, tech debt comes with it if you're trying to turn this into something production ready. And I think if you know like what's the finish line, then you can make that and say like, okay, the tech debt doesn't matter because this is going to be an analog script. Then I think that sometimes also you don't know when the PM's going to be like, can we do this live?
And you can try out Voila or something.
There
Just
we
run a
go.
web server on the Jupyter.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm curious if you had any tips on like testing with Jupyter Notebooks that you're planning to put in production, because that's something I
Yeah.
kind of struggle with. Is like, it seems like I have to get it into a script if I'm going to test it, versus
Yeah.
like testing things in a notebook seems hard.
Gotcha. So around testing, I think the unit testing scene with notebooks is not too good, but with Papermill, you can obviously do like integration tests very easily. You can run the notebook end to end, see if it passes for various different parameters. You can, do some assertions on the output of the notebook. Like the notebook can output another notebook, but it can also output some files as well, some data files or some images or something like that, and you can check that those results are correct. In terms of like unit testing, I think if you're at the point where you have like functions that are reusable and you want to have a unit test, that's probably the point where you should move those out of the notebook and into a Python package or something, and only keep the like glue code inside the notebook. Yeah.
I think building on that last question, at what point in time do all these tools get built on top of notebooks and make your job harder than just writing a regular Python script? Can you too many easy steps to the point where now we're doing something really, really hard, but it would be easy to be able to any of those things?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, if you're at the point where you feel like having these unit tests is really critical for you to verify the correctness of the code, obviously at that point you should reevaluate. For like, obviously for like anything you think is a shareable library, probably shouldn't even start with a notebook. But yeah, I would say like personally, my main use case for using notebooks is the one around like very heavy data computation, where if I make like a typo in one query, then I have to rerun the entire Python script from scratch, and that would take several hours just to get to an intermediate point where I can, in a notebook, I can just keep that result around in memory. So that's probably, at work, that's what I mostly use notebooks for, as well as for like machine learning stuff where I'm just prototyping. But at the end, I'll probably convert those into packages for production.
So you're not building websites out of notebooks just yet?
No, I'm not building web servers in notebooks yet.
If someone does, please tell us.
But I will say, like, some of this stuff is new to me as well, but in the past I've had experiences where, PMs have asked me, hey, can you generate this, like, reports of, how much the reviews on Yelp changed over the past month or something like that, and it would have been really handy if I could just point them to a notebook, you can type whatever date range you want in the parameter, and then it can generate a new report for you, rather than, having to ask me, hey, can you generate a new report and send me it.
One more thing on the testing front, I was going to say, it is possible to run doc tests in a notebook, and doc tests are actually kind of a nice way to do kind of lightweight unit testing where you're maybe not going up to a full-blown test suite, but want to do some sanity checks.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that. That sounds interesting.
What exactly is it? What's a doc test?
So in your doc string on a function, you can actually write what essentially looks like interactive REPL. So you write what you would have typed into the REPL and the result that it would have produced.
Nice.
You run doc test against that, it runs the same code and sees if the output is the same.
Wow. That's super cool. I've also seen a puppy person that wrote a widely cited blog post on this called property-based testing, where you basically have decorators that generate values that are passed in to try to break your code.
Is this like hypothesis or?
Yeah. But it bugs me to no end that it's called hypothesis for testing, and it's not hypothesis testing.
What do you use when you're editing Python outside of notebook? PyCharm or VS Code?
I usually use VS Code or just Vim inside the command line, depending on how lazy I am. VS Code is probably a bit better when I'm working multiple files, but sometimes I'm SSH in the server. I'm just too lazy to set up a remote session.
Databricks is not really a notebook tool, it's a data lake tool that
Yeah.
happens to have a notebook on top.
Right, but they're probably trying to build out anything that could be remotely useful to that data lake.
It's more of a server-side tool, though.
Yeah.
It's Spark. It's basically the Spark query engine for data lakes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not really meant to play in this space.
Well, yeah, the Spark Query Engine is their core product, but they also build out, like a Jupyter environment where you can integrate with that Spark computation layer.
Yeah, but it's that they included. That's
Yeah.
not really their primary.
Exactly, but it's probably a lot easier to spin up a Jupyter notebook to access that Spark cluster in Databricks using their thing than to try to connect your own notebook to Databricks somehow.
Do you see anyone using Zeppelin? That lets you mix languages in one notebook.
Yeah, I looked at Zeppelin a bit. I'm not sure why it didn't take off as much. I'm not too familiar. I've used it a couple times in the past. Didn't really have anything negative to say about it, but I guess probably it just has a less lively plug-in third-party developer scene going on.
I don't know what it's like now, but when I tried to use Zeppelin like 5 years ago. It was a giant pain to get set up.
Okay.
There's just like a lot of, like, I could not figure it out for the life of me. Whereas Jupyter is just like, you can install Jupyter.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. I think Zeppelin, like at the beginning, it had a lot better integration with stuff like Spark, but pretty much in Jupyter now you can connect to a Spark kernel. So I don't really know if there's a gap still compared to Zeppelin. It's a good call out. I mean, maybe some people prefer the interface of Zeppelin or its integration with Jupyter. That's fine as well.
Any more questions or?
Question. I'll make myself vulnerable over here because it might be really stupid. I work in a really regulated area in medical, and so I'm familiar with the data scientist comes up with an algorithm, and then the engineer has to implement. And part of our industry is that we have to actually document the handoff between the data scientist and the engineer, so that if there's a problem, it can be traced. And the documentation is often read by non-engineers. So my question, and with the setup, it might sound like I'm going to ask a really difficult question, but do you know of a good way to output a Jupyter notebook like presentation into like a PDF? I mean, we've tried things like printing, using the native, browser PDF printer, and it doesn't do anything.
Gotcha. I'm not sure about PDF specifically, but for that purpose or like documentation is a huge factor. Maybe you can look into something like MBDev or Portal. Those are, I've seen demos where they have very, very nice like web documentation, and I'm sure you can convert that to a PDF just based on a notebook.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think Jupyter Lab can do it. You can export to the
Export a
commercial
PDF.
format.
Yeah, I can export a PDF as well, but maybe.
I've done that in a regular Jupyter notebook too, it's just like in the file menu, like
Yeah.
like HTML or PDF or something.
I hope it's not an easy answer because I've wasted some time.
I mean, you can
No,
just.
the PDF
so-
export is definitely, it's iffy.
Oh
Are you
my god.
trying to get just the code, or do you want output too?
Kind of the code and the output. It's documenting like what the data scientist presented to the engineer.
Oh, look at
Like
Porto.
convince the engineer to then produce that in a production.
Can you bring a Portal and show?
Yeah.
Or at least
Porto lets you like basically export Beamer slide, take your document and like change a flag to export slide, like PDF slides.
Is there a good page I should go to here, or?
Well, just so you can see how it's spelled. Because
Oh,
when you're
Portal.
looking at it,
I see.
here, you don't necessarily
Gotcha,
know
makes
what
sense.
it's
Yeah, it's Portal.
Okay.
Cool. The tool you showed earlier about converting and linking to Markdown files, did that Markdown file output be useful? That was just like that.
I think that's essentially what Porter is doing under the hood.
Yeah, but I think Portal has like nicer formatting because if you just want the output of the notebook, like you just want the output in a different format, like HTML file or PDF, you can do that directly. You can export it as a PDF. It's just going to be a PDF that
We
looks.
had bad experiences with that.
Yeah,
It
it's
just doesn't-
right. It's a PDF that looks exactly like the notebook, which might not be what you want, but Portal like does like beautiful documentation
and it'll
and
take like
Porto has like an echo flag, so where if you set it to false, it doesn't print any of the code, it just has the output.
okay.
There's like a whole like detailed like API with all these different flags, and you can store them in an external file and apply them to like every Porto file in your analysis.
I was wondering if this MBDev thing that you were talking about. Because I saw this in documentation.
yeah. So MBDev heavily integrates Jupyter with Portal, and I think if you just look at their tutorial, that would be a pretty good starting point. I think Jeremy kind of shows how he takes the notebook and it turns into a beautiful website with documentation,
Okay.
stuff hidden that you don't want to see, and the stuff that you want to keep on the website.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, as you were saying earlier, the visualization and the ability to step through an algorithm is
Yeah.
really powerful.
Yeah.
But then it's kind of like, I want to archive that. And if I just save like a Python notebook and then a regulator wants to open it, they'll have no idea.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, maybe that's a good use case to look into MBDev. Yeah.
I may have missed it. When people convert to production, they want to take a Jupyter notebook and make it into a REST API. Do you see them use Java? They use Python. You can use a multitude of languages.
That's a good question. So, question about converting a Jupyter to a REST API. I don't really see too much use case where you want to do that conversion. Like usually, REST API development starts from Python scripts. For Jupyter, I think most of the like destinations are like batch jobs. You know, something you want to run infrequently from time to time.
But if they built a data science solution, you're going to be able, you want to take something like ONNX and deploy it, you know, take it in ONNX format or text or photo. So how do you make that a production?
Yeah, I think that really depends on like the engineering team you have, because you can do this in Python, you can do it in Java, you can do it in Scala. Like all these things have great ways to integrate with Spark, other tools you're using there. It really just depends what's the team comfortable with and what's going to meet the needs of the tech requirements they have.
Yeah, I mean, on the team I work with in Stewart, like we take the Python code from scientists and convert it all into Java, which I would say is not ideal because the conversion doesn't always go one-to-one perfectly. I mean, it's a lot easier to try to like, you know, refactor some Python into other Python code.
But Python's not a very good language for serious work.
That
That is not true. Oh my God.
I think, you know, for a lot of use cases where it's heavily I/O bound or like GPU bound or something, like the Python part isn't really doing much. It's just like passing off some data into underlying C code, in which case maybe it's not that big of an issue.
Yeah. If you run into the GIL, you've got a big problem.
Yeah, that's true.
It's
But
severely limited.
ideally, you know, everything important is not running in Python. Python's just the API layer, and then C does everything. But you know, if you do have a like multi-threading issue that needs to be done in Python, that might be a problem. Yeah. That's a whole other debate. Maybe we can have a whole talk on that. Like, should we be using Python?
Well, C's for guys that can't write in assembly.
Yeah, maybe we should just all go back to assembly. We'll definitely learn good practices.
And also like Julia, where the whole point is it's like everything is entirely within Julia, the same way that MATLAB is not
Yeah.
calling any code that is not MATLAB.
And that's-
Julia is in that like catch-22 situation of like not a lot of people use Julia, but there's not a lot of people use Julia.
Yeah, I think that's that's a luxury of writing like a language from scratch without having like compatibility issues and then use cases being piled on top of a language you never meant it to be doing. That's why like most of underlying libraries for Python are written in C. You know, people are using Python for all these like production like latency critical use cases now, and there's no way to solve that except to like delegate to C code.
I think it's definitely like use the right tool for the job, but
Yeah.
you might be surprised at places where Python's running, like Instagram's backend still runs on Django,
Yeah.
and they're
How about PHP?
people still use it. Look at Facebook.
People still use it.
Well-
Half the internet's PHP.
Yeah,
I think-
Facebook.
I mean, honestly, listening to the stuff about like Notebook REST server, it's like, oh god, we've gone back to PHP.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there's like debate about like what language is best, what's slower or faster. But if you check like the ranking of fastest web servers, it's all over the place. Some years Java is the fastest, some years PHP is the fastest, some years it's Python. It's like it's all tricks now, you know. Like they have C++ running under the hood no matter what language it is. So
Also, we need those tests to do nothing other than output hello world. So
Yeah,
may
that's
not be
true.
terribly applicable.
yeah, most real life use cases are like IO bound things. It's not just you know how much raw requests you can, how much raw request throughput you can get.
Do you see they what a wheel format used?
Wheel?
Wheel format.
Yeah.
Pickle. Those are Python formats.
Yeah, Vue. I mean, Vue is like the packaging format, right? I think that is taken. Yeah, so Vue is used all over the place right now. Like, you just do pip install most of them on packages good now. For Pickle, it is quite a nice way to persist stuff, but the issue that has turned us away from Pickle a lot is because it's not compatible across Python versions. Like if you train a model, you persist as a Pickle, and you try to run it, like you train it in Python Pickle 6, you try to run it in Python Pickle 9, it won't work. Even if the library itself has no